Life Audio.
My husband and I got married super young. I was 18, he was 21, and we had like a really big wedding actually, but it was a very scaled down wedding. I'm talking our reception was in the fellowship hall of the church. Our wedding dinner, rehearsal dinner was in the same reception hall at the church. And the night before we got married, we're literally having like spaghetti and garlic bread. That was our rehearsal dinner that was made by like the church ladies. And my mother said to me, "Aren't you going to go fix your husband his plate?" And I went off. Like it was absolutely uncharacteristic of me, but I was so upset with her. And when I was able to unpack that situation, like why did I respond in that way? It's because I saw my mom fix my stepdad's plate for years, and he was so ungrateful. And I looked at how he treated her, and I felt like she allowed herself to be treated that way. And so when she said that simple thing to me, "Aren't you going to go fix your husband's plate?" It was a trigger. And I went back just that quickly to being a little girl and watching this very dysfunctional dynamic.
Welcome to the Faith Over Fear podcast, where we discuss powerful truths to quiet anxiety and fear, big and small. We are passionate about helping God's children discover, embrace, and experience His freedom. I would love to connect with you online or to speak at your next event. Visit our show notes to learn how to connect with me. I'm Jennifer Slattery, and I have found relationships, they can be a great source of joy and fulfillment, but they can also lead to a lot of pain, a lot of stress, and a lot of anxiety. And I think it's safe to say many of us have relationships that aren't as strong as we would like. And maybe we've even noticed certain patterns that have left us weary of allowing others close. And sadly, we live in a broken, sin-ravished world filled with wounded people who, in turn, wound others. And we've all experienced hurt, rejection, and betrayal, past experiences that affect our relationships and our perceptions. In short, we all have emotional baggage that weigh us down and clogs our souls and hinders our ability to experience the depth of relational connection we long for and to which God calls us. And today, I've invited a fellow Life Audio podcaster, Dana Shea Williams, on to help me unpack, pun intended, this topic so that we can all live more deeply connected and fulfilling lives. Dana, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Dana Shea Williams is a speaker, a relationship coach, and host of the Rebuilding Us podcast. And that's actually why I reached out to her, because I listened to her podcast. She is also a teaching pastor at a multi-site, multi-ethnic church in Virginia Beach, Virginia. In every setting, Dana's mission is singular: to help lead people into more fruitful and connected relationships with the Lord and each other. On the podcast, she is known for her graceful candor, her humor, and encouraging yet challenging advice. Dana holds a BA in communication from Regent University. She lives in Virginia Beach, Virginia, with her husband of 24 years and their 4 children. Dana, I enjoyed your podcast, and specifically, you actually had an episode on emotional baggage, really focusing on marriage, and you helped listeners to consider if they might have a few unnecessary, maybe ineffective garments shoved in their suitcases. So when you say emotional baggage, what do you mean?
Well, the psychological definition really is unresolved trauma, and so when I'm thinking of emotional baggage, I'm thinking about unresolved pain, unresolved relational issues from the past that have actually taken up space in the present.
I love that. So anytime we think like I'm just shoving it down, it's probably not really shoved down, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Personally, I think we all have some degree of baggage, right? Like that's part of just growing in Jesus Christ. It seems like we're kind of trucking along and something happens. We're like, oh, here's another area that maybe I am not living as radiantly, I guess I would say, as Jesus Christ calls us to. You probably see that a lot in just pastoring.
Absolutely. And I agree with you 100%, Jennifer. I think that we all have unresolved issues. A friend of mine used to always say that there are no marriage problems. There are just childhood problems that manifest in marriage. That's true. Whether you're married or whether you're a single adult, there are issues from our childhood. This is why so many times in therapy, they focus so much on childhood trauma, because we are shaped. I often tell my clients, you've marinated in this environment for 18 years, right?
Yeah.
And that's going to come out in the relationships in your present.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I remind myself, I heard it from, so I'm actually, I will say to listeners, they know, but I am a lifelong therapy person. Like I am in therapy for life. I'm a lifelonger. And so, and I learned in therapy that we usually marry to our emotional health. That helped me recognize in two ways. One, if I'm thinking this issue is always somebody else's, and I actually heard you say that on your podcast. Like if you think it's
Hmm.
somebody else's and you keep running into this thing, then maybe you need to look at yourself, either your patterns or your perspective. I think it can be intertwined, and not recognizing, even like that to me was a big challenge. My husband and I will be married 30 years this coming summer. And initially we were such a mess, Dana. Oh my goodness. I cannot even say. And I just thought it was all him. And I didn't even realize my very perspective was faulty. Like the way I saw him and his behaviors, it went through this lens. I like to call it garbage tainted glasses.
Mm.
And so that was
Yeah.
that was a challenge for me.
No, it's true. I think, we are all challenged to look in the mirror and to see, and it's not about making ourselves feel guilty or condemned or putting ourselves down, but it's being self-aware, really taking an honest inventory of our weaknesses, of our faults, of our fears. And I think it's so appropriate that you said that we oftentimes will marry the opposite. I think that the Lord does that on purpose because we need each other in marriage. Like I need my husband, and oftentimes opposites attract. So his strengths are my weaknesses and vice versa. And if we're not aware of that, then we'll look at that other opposite, we'll look at that strength and we'll feel like it's a detriment to our relationship and not a strength, not a blessing that God is actually using our spouse to help make us more like him, which is really why I say that marriage is probably one of God's best discipleship tools out there because it shapes you and it helps you to actually become more like Christ.
Right. And I was thinking too, as you're talking about like the opposites, I've even seen people opposites in conflict resolution, neither version healthy, but then they kind of work against each other. Like if you have somebody who the way they handle emotions is to shut down and to withdraw, and then you've got somebody else, the way they handle emotions is more outward and maybe to attack and lash out, neither of which are healthy, right? Fight or flight. And then they don't recognize, and the flight person is triggering the fight person, so that makes
Hmm.
them fight more, and vice versa.
That was our story. My husband grew up in a home where he didn't really see conflict at all. And I think his parents thought that that was healthy. They thought this is a good thing. We don't want our children to see conflict. But the problem was he never learned how to resolve conflict in a healthy way because it wasn't modeled for him. And then I'm on the way opposite end of the spectrum where I saw conflict and major dysfunction my whole childhood. So we get together and we're exactly what you're describing, where he would shut down, not talk, go away. Conflict was a scary thing. And I'm like, let's do this right now. And so it just created so much unnecessary tension, so much unnecessary pain because neither one of us knew how to actually resolve a situation properly.
Yeah, and I think too, so in this episode we're not just speaking about marriage, although I know there's probably a good number of listeners who are hearing this and wanting help with their marriage, but also with relationship with your kids, with your coworkers, with your boss. You can see these same dynamics play out. And you talk in your episode too about codependency. And
Mm-hmm.
you gave some examples. I'll let you share when you were leading your listeners. Hey, how do I know if I'm being codependent? You gave a couple examples.
Yeah, I think one of the telltale signs is the lack of boundaries. When you are allowing people to treat you, and I say that on purpose because people treat you the way you allow them to treat you. When I hear people are like, "Oh, my spouse, they're disrespecting me and they're saying these things to me," and my immediate response, obviously I'm empathetic, but then it's like, okay, well, what boundaries are in place? So let's say you are in a working environment and you're always being put down by your boss and you just allow that behavior to go on because you feel that you don't have enough maybe authority or you feel like it's not your place to stand up for yourself or what have you. So I think the telltale sign is a lack of boundaries. And then again, we're going to sound like a broken record a little bit, but going back to the childhood trauma, if you grew up in a home where your feelings were diminished or where you were kind of children are taught to be seen, not heard, so you grew up in that environment, then it's going to be difficult for you to actually show up as your full self in any kind of relationship. And then if you are then attached to someone who is an enabler, well, the codependent and the enabler, that's like a recipe for disaster all over the place, regardless of what kind of relationship it's in.
Right. And I would even expect, so we've had Dr. Allison Cook on our episode. She wrote The Best of You, and I'm going to read a little bit. She challenges us. She says it we tend to be even more codependent in Christianity because we're taught, and I think there's some confusion. We don't understand. We're taught to love selflessly. But so she gives an example. She differentiates between selflessness, selfhood, and selfishness. And she talks about how we want selfhood. And she gives just a couple examples, maybe our listeners, because sometimes codependency can also show up and we are like when somebody is hurting, if we're high empathy, we want to fix it and our emotions become overly entangled. And so it's not just I have compassion for you. It's like I'm going to jump into this situation and I'm going to fix whatever's causing you pain. Well, that also is how codependency, some examples, she said codependency, you don't think I'm a bad person, right? So you're getting your value from them versus healthy dependency. I'm struggling with guilt. Are you available to listen? Or selfishness. I only answer to myself. So I think I really like, and you talked about, so if you lose your voice, and that might be one way we lose, if we're tying our value to somebody else's opinion of us and acceptance of us, even our spouses, I think, or even our parents or our kids, that to me is a sign that there's a disconnect between us and God, right? That receiving from God.
Absolutely. And not knowing your identity, regardless of where you are in your Christian faith, it's so important that we understand we get our worth and our value from who God made us intrinsically. We have worth because we're made in his image, period, point blank. So no one can add to that. No one can subtract from that. When we begin to look at other people, be it a spouse, a friend, a coworker, a job, career, success, fill in the blank, then that's when we get ourselves in trouble. And that's when we start to get our value, or at least we think we're getting our value from these other people or these other situations. And so where this really breaks down in relationships is then we don't get our needs met because no one is able to complete us the way that our culture has taught us. No one is able to do that. And so then we bounce from relationship to relationship, situation to situation, wanting so desperately to feel validated when we don't realize we're already validated just because of who we are in Christ.
Right. And I think that's part of that onion unpacking too, that because we may not even realize, like, it's one thing to say, okay, I'm a daughter of Christ, but then how do we live that out? And it's a difference between an intellectual and like feeling it in your soul, at least from my experience, and understanding too that some of those emotions that can play out, and you had referenced from our childhood, and I think we can be trained to respond, like the roles we play in childhood. I knew a woman, she had a covert narcissist mom. And so her mom, whenever she didn't like what was going on, her emotions would escalate and she would tell everybody she was dying. Like, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. Like, heart attack, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. Well, this woman, she becomes an adult and she has a child of her own. And she's never really unpacked that the way she was taught to view emotion, intense emotion, and then to respond. Well, then she had a highly emotive teenager and not recognizing this. And so she was shutting her daughter down when she would become emotional. And it took her like years of therapy to finally understand, oh, my brain, because it was an implicit memory, right? Like it was a reaction that was it was like a survival reaction that she hadn't unpacked. And then my brain, my like survivalist brain is telling me my daughter is about to die. I got to shut it down. But reality says she's highly emotive. And so that just to our listeners, you had mentioned in your podcast, if you are responding more intensely than the situation warrants, I would suggest, the one thing my therapist will always bring me to, my spirit-led self, and she qualifies that as confidence, creativity, compassion, clarity, and a bunch of different C's. And she will ask me, like, are you responding from your spirit-led self? Does this seem like a response from your spirit-led self. And sometimes when she says that, I'm able to pull back and say, huh, no, that doesn't sound compassionate. That doesn't sound creative. That doesn't sound confident or calm.
Yeah. I mean, there's a story I can tell you that goes in perfect alignment with this. When we got married, my husband and I got married super young. I was 18, he was 21, and we had like a really big wedding actually, but it was a very scaled down wedding. I'm talking our reception was in the fellowship hall of the church. Our wedding dinner, rehearsal dinner was in the same reception hall at the church. And the night before we got married, we're literally having like spaghetti and garlic bread. That was our rehearsal dinner that was made by like the church ladies.
Nice.
And my mother said to me, "Aren't you going to go fix your husband his plate?" And I went off. Like it
Yeah.
was absolutely uncharacteristic of me, but I was so upset with her. And I when I was able to unpack that situation, like why did I respond in that way? It's because I saw my mom fix my stepdad's plate for years and he was so ungrateful. And I looked at how he treated her and I felt like she allowed herself to be treated that way. And so when she said that simple thing to me, "Aren't you going to go fix your husband's plate?" It was a trigger. And I went back just that quickly to being a little girl and watching this very dysfunctional dynamic. So when I'm saying to people, like, you have to look at your responses and again, not judge yourself and not condemn yourself, but almost like take inventory and be like, huh, that's interesting. Why did I respond that way? Why did that comment upset me so much? Why am I still thinking about this thing that person said 3 weeks later? Where's the root of that? And those of us who are in our faith, those of us who know the Lord, being able to say, God, I need you to help me
Yes.
to heal that part of me. That's where the freedom and the healing comes from, is when we acknowledge it. And then when we bring the Lord into that situation and say, Lord, there's some unhealed, unresolved trauma there that I really need you to help me to deal with. And for some, God will do that, like you and him. And then for others, you need some help. You need to be
Yeah.
able to sit with someone and help, allow them to help you to unpack that a little bit more.
I can be highly self deceived. Like I have a defense mechanism that will deceive me, and then I've got my family of origin training that can deceive me. I mean, there's so many things, past pain that can deceive me, and so it can be helpful for me to have someone who can help me, like even as an example, well, and you gave an example with your marriage, right? Like if you didn't grow up seeing a healthy marriage, or let's say you're a mom and you didn't have a healthy mom, I think for me that's sometimes where a lot of my confusion will come from. And it'll be like, okay, well, what does it look like to parent a 25-year-old health, in a healthy manner? What, and we talked about codependency in the past, and I've seen this with a lot of parenting dynamics, because there's a really weird boundary line that you don't always know exists, right, between helping your
Right.
child be successful and
Yes.
rescuing them. So I think having a person who is, it helps if they're trained and if they've
Mm-hmm.
done
Mm-hmm.
their work themselves, so that they can be like, huh, that seems a little ineffective.
Yeah, absolutely. Those of us who are Christians, a lot of times I think we're guilty of wanting God to do things that God has given us people to help. Like, look, if we say, God, I need a hug, right? I need affection. Well, God's not going to reach his hand out of heaven and give that. He's going to send you a person. He's going to send you a brother or sister, a friend, a mom, a spouse, a friend. He's going to send you somebody, right? And it's the same where we're realizing these things about ourselves. I love that you said that we can be so easily deceived, because we all are, and we will talk ourselves out of getting the help that we need. We'll say, "Oh, I talk to people like this every single week, Jennifer. We can do this by ourselves." And I'm like, "Yeah, you've been doing it by yourself for 10 years.
Yeah.
And how's that going?" It's okay. It's okay to need help. It's okay. I mean, this is why God didn't just like place us on an island by ourselves, because we need one another. And so in that way, we are interdependent, which is not codependent. It's different. We're
Right.
interdependent upon one another. And it's actually a good and healthy thing to be able to say, like, these are some things that I'm learning about myself. I'm realizing that my responses are a little bit too much for that situation. I need someone to help me with this. And I love that you said, having someone that's trained. There's a lot of, I work in a church, and so there's a lot of pastors who are great, amazing shepherds, wonderful people, not great counselors. So even in the church, like we have to be discerning enough to say maybe your pastor's not the one to help you walk through that. Maybe there is a therapist or a coach or someone else who has been trained in these certain aspects to be able to help you to overcome some of these things.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful too. You've mentioned, and I think I mentioned too, talking about just child of origin, family of origin things. I think we can see a lot of our unhealthy relational patterns if we pause and we say, okay, what patterns do we see that were practiced before us? Are we pushing the opposite, which sometimes can be not good? Like we can go so far extreme that we're unhealthy on the other way, or are we following these patterns? And so another woman I know, she had a pattern generationally of estrangement. There was people were just cutting people off relationally
Mm,
all over the place. Like children weren't speaking to the adult children weren't speaking to their parents, and parents weren't speaking to their siblings. And so then when this individual, she began parenting adult children, and there was some tension, with some normal tension, I think, but she was so terrified that she was following this pattern because that's what she had seen, and she just thought it was the way things worked out. But then she was able to pull back and
mm,
analyze, and she's like, they were estranged because they didn't work on themselves. They were pointing the
mm,
finger at everybody else. It's their fault that I'm mad. But nobody in this long line of generational estrangement had said, okay, what are the patterns of behavior within me? What is, to use your term, baggage? What's in my
mm-hmm,
suitcase
mm-hmm.
that is leading to all of these broken relationships? And so that was transformational for her to pause and analyze that.
I think that we do have to we're always growing, we're always learning and being gentle with ourselves, understanding that, I think about like you, I've been in therapy for many, many years myself, right? And there was one time I had said something to my therapist and I said, I think this particular person I was talking about did the best job that they could. And my therapist said, what if they didn't?
Oh.
And I was like, oh, like I really have to like sit with that.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
whoa, right? Because like I had been giving this person grace, 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 but there were some things that were happening that just were not okay. And that is where a part of our healing, we have to tell the truth. We have to tell the truth about what happened. It's not about making excuses for how our parents raised us. I have a good heart, as most people do. Like, you want to believe the best about people, but there are certain things that we have to just be willing to tell the truth about. Like, that was not okay. That was not appropriate. That was not how I should have been raised or loved. My needs did matter and they weren't being met. So, being honest is the first step in the healing process, and then forgiving. Forgiveness plays such a crucial aspect. And this is the thing about forgiveness. The person that hurt you does not have to ask for forgiveness for you to grant it. I taught my kids this from the time they were little because they would like get in little squabbles and fights. And, I would say, you need to forgive your brother. Well, they didn't ask me, and they don't have to ask you. Now, of course, that's ideal for that person to come back and
For
repent and say, you know what?
reconciliation, right.
Exactly, for reconciliation. However, even if they don't, your forgiveness is really for you. And there is a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. You can forgive someone and never be reconciled to them. This happens all the time. If someone has died, for example, and maybe there was some sort of trauma attached to them, right? That they hurt you in some way. Well, they're gone. You can't reconcile with them, but you still need to forgive.
Yeah.
Or spouses who divorce. There's not going to be a reconciliation there in most cases, but you still have to forgive because forgiveness frees you, it heals you to be able to go on to the next. And what I've realized is that in a lot of relationships, this baggage exists because people are holding on to unforgiveness from
Mm.
past hurt, from past relationships. They're in a new relationship now and they're wondering why. Why can't I truly be free? Why can't I really be happy? Why can't I really trust? And it goes back to the unforgiveness that they're holding.
So would you say that's even another indication is if you are struggling to trust, assuming that the person is not doing anything to break your trust. If the person is continually breaking your trust, that's, I would say, let's be honest, right? Like you talk
Right.
about the and you can even have high compassion for someone and still be honest about their behavior, right? You can be like, I'm so sorry
100%.
you're an addict, that
Right.
I grieve that, but I'm not going to let you destroy my life or control
100%.
my emotions. But so just speak to us about, let's say we're in a relationship and we're noticing distrust. What would you do with that?
Hmm. I mean, you hit it on the nail. A lack of trust is a telltale sign that you're holding on to baggage, especially if there's been no offense. So we see this all the time. I know that, looking outside of marriages, but classically in marriages where there has been abuse or some sort of mistrust in a prior relationship, you're now in a new relationship and you're being triggered all the time by just random things, random things.
Like
So
spaghetti.
spaghetti, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or your spouse comes home 10 minutes late and now you've developed this whole story in your mind about how they're, cheating with the secretary and they're going to leave you. And so when we notice, and I think it's important that we notice it when it starts, not like when it's full blown, but when you start to notice yourself not trusting the person that you're in relationship with, not trusting what they say is true, not trusting their intentions, not trusting their desire for you,
I
even
think that's big. Say that again, intentions,
their
because I think
intentions.
that can be a big one too, that you can't maybe necessarily name, but you're like, they don't really love me. They're not real.
Exactly.
Yeah. So go ahead. I'm sorry, but
Yeah, and that plays in the background, right? Plays in the background of our minds. Like, someone will say something to us, and then you go back to something that your parents said or something that happened to you maybe on the previous job. Maybe your boss was a jerk on your previous job, and your new boss is really just trying to hold you up to a higher standard, and you're thinking, yeah, they think I can't do anything right. Nobody thinks I can do anything right. So when you start to notice that voice, because we always talk about like how God speaks to us in the still small whisper, well, so does the enemy. And so like we have to learn how to discern, how to differentiate between those two voices. And when you are always thinking of the negative thing, that's when we have to stop and say, okay, what is this? Again, tell the truth. Like, what is this really? Where is this coming from? And then, God, I need you to help me to believe the best. Now, I always say this: if there is something that is going on, let's say you have a trust issue and you're like, I really feel like there's something going on, trust that God is going to reveal that to you. Like, it's not God's desire for you to walk around in darkness, just not knowing and, just believing that everything is on the up and up when someone is really taking advantage of you or someone is not necessarily being truthful with you. So trust that God is going to reveal that to you. And of course, if there are real signs, pay attention to those signs. We're not like living in la la land here. So I think we just have to be really honest with ourselves about, is this just a fear that I have? Or is this really something that I need to pay attention to?
I love that. And I know for me, I've in times when I've gone through what I would call relational storms, I felt like sometimes I will want the end result. Like, Lord, what's going to happen in 10? Like, are we going to do this and this and this and everything's going to be great? And he will continually bring me back to, I've told you to do this right now. And oftentimes when I look later, it's okay because I had so much work to do in this one season. I was ready to run up ahead, but he's like, we got some unpacking to do. And so when you talked about, God will reveal things to us, and he does, but I think also coupled with that is just trusting that he will reveal what we need to know today.
Absolutely. In time. That's so true. I was telling a girlfriend that last week. I was telling her because my husband and I we have a testimony. Like God really restored our marriage.
Praise
And
God.
there was a point in our marriage where I was always looking for something. And I had good cause. My trust had been broken. And so I was always looking for something. And I got to the point where I said, Lord, show me what I need to know. If I don't need to know it, I don't want to know it. Because
Amen.
there are times that God does protect us. He's like, you can't handle that right now.
Right.
So I'm going to shield that from you, but not because I want you to be ignorant, but because I want you healed first. And when you're stronger and when you're able to handle that, then I'm going to reveal it. But then God only reveals to heal. So he doesn't just like throw something on us just so that we're like in shock and disbelief. He's like, hey, I got something to tell. It's like a good friend. Hey, I got
Right.
something to tell you. This is going to sting a little bit, but I'm right here. I'm going to help walk you through this. And this is why I know that people are in different stages of their faith, but I am so thankful for the Holy Spirit that is our
Amen.
comforter.
Amen.
Oh my goodness. I could not do this without him. He's
No.
our guide. He's our advocate. He gives us wisdom. He's our friend. And so when we walk in relationship with him, then we know that, yeah, we can go through some really hard things. We can go through some challenging, painful things, but he's going to help walk us through that and get us to the path of healing.
Yeah. And I would even say maybe to leave our listeners with this assurance, even if the relationship you are currently in right now, like what is causing you the most anxiety, even if that particular relationship doesn't turn out, because I think we know we live in a broken world. And like I said, estrangement
Mhm.
does happen. Walls remain. You can do your part and work really hard, and the other person can say, I don't want to work on it.
Mhm.
But I'm a firm believer, even if that's the scenario, if we are doing our part and if we are leaning towards God and we're listening to Him and we're following Him, He will bring us to fulfilling relationships. As we get healthier, our relationships naturally will become healthier. And some people will either come along for the ride and get healthy too, or they will choose to stay in their dysfunction. And then, like you said, that's the honesty piece, right? And grieving, but saying that doesn't mean just because this relationship dies,
Mhm.
that means that I'm never going to have a fulfilling relationship again.
Right. I love that you said that there are some people who choose to stay in their dysfunction. And because we have a loving God, He doesn't force His will on people. He gives us free will. He gives people the freedom to choose. And that goes both ways. So you have the freedom to choose to be in a healthy relationship. That other person might not make the same choice, but that's okay. That's their choice. But you're going to have to go along without them. And when we try to stay, this is what I see a lot. We try to stay in these relationships and we're pulling the other person, come on, get healthy, get healthy. And that person is just not, they're not there. They're not going to be there. So then you've got to make a decision. Am I going to stay and allow these things to continue to go on? Or am I going to say, you know what? I got to go on with God. Like, I have to be healthy. I have to grow. I have to mature. This is not God's best for me. And that's a hard conversation to have. And obviously that should not be done without, some sort of wise counsel. But I think it is very important that we realize that we do have free will and we get to choose. And that's the beautiful thing about living in Christ, having a relationship with God, is that He always gives us freedom. That's His gift to us. Freedom in our relationships, freedom to love, freedom to choose.
Right.
And we're going to wrap up here, but I think, when I'm helping people to determine when do I reconcile again, because every relationship is not reconcilable in that season. I believe that God's heart is always for reconciliation when possible, but sometimes reconciliation takes many years. It's a long journey. So keeping your heart open, I think, is really important. That whether God restores that relationship, maybe it's friends. I've had to walk away from some friends. My heart's not hardened toward them, but that's not a viable relationship right now. Am I open to reconciliation? Sure. If things change and if things are healthy and again, they're kind of choosing the right path and they're choosing to go along, then great, reconciliation can happen. But I think we need to always be willing to keep our hearts open, to keep our hearts soft, to continue to learn about ourselves, to continue to open our hearts to the Lord and say, God, would you shine your light in my heart? Because there are dark areas in my heart that I'm unaware of. And even the best of us with the best of intentions, we still got some corners and shadows. So, God, would you shine your light in my heart so that I can be the healthiest, most loving person that I can be and reflect that to the people around me?
And I think that's a great place for us. Ask that question every day, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. It was awesome.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I do just want to let people know, part of what I do as a coach is I do help people to build connected relationships. So whether you're married, whether you're dating, I do have a quiz that I like to invite people to take because I think especially for people who have been married a long time, we think that we're connected because we're in a commitment, but not necessarily. So I have a quiz on my website. If they go to danashay.com, that's DANACHE, danashay.com/partner quiz. They can take a quiz to find out how connected you are in your relationships. And then I'm sharing with people resources. Okay, let's say you're apathetic or you're disconnected. These are some practical steps that you can take today to get back on track.
Nice. Well, and I'll put that in the show notes as well, so listeners can click right there in the show notes. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Well, thank you for listening. If you haven't already done so, I encourage you to subscribe to this podcast. Then you won't miss a single episode. Share it with your friends. And until next time, may you live as one who truly has been set free.